start our tribute to the Beatles off. First, we're going to bring in Charles Rosenay. Charles, come on in.
Hi
Hi,
there.
Charles. Hello there. So,
Hey.
Charles, I understand you have loved the Beatles from the first time you saw them. Tell us about that.
My first memory in life is seeing the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show. And from then on, I was hooked. I was this little guy who loved monster movies, who loved the Beatles, and loved baseball. And everything became secondary to those three things. And my parents were wonderful because they would buy me all the records and all the comics, everything related to Beatles, and they wouldn't throw stuff out. You know, everyone hears those horror stories of the parents who moved or this is, you know, you've outgrown this, psh, right in the dumpster, right in the trash, right in the incinerator. My parents kept everything, and I kept that love. And you know, jump ahead to college. I heard there were Beatle conventions in Boston and New York. And I thought, well, I'm in Connecticut. I'm in the middle. I don't want to travel those places. So let me produce my own Beatles convention. Sure, right? And I did. And it was the worst bomb. It was a terrible event, but I learned all the things not to do. And I continued to do it. And I've been doing conventions and festivals ever since.
How old were you when you put on your first Beatles convention?
I was probably just left high school, so probably 17. And you know, how do you do a convention when you're just a kid and really don't know what to do? First of all, you get a lot of people who support you, which I had. I sold a bunch of things from my own collection, which I since had to rebuy for a lot more money. You know, I was in college radio. Or had just started doing DJ work. And I thought, well, I have a lot of friends in radio stations. So let me call them, not realizing there was a thing called advertising and that I had to actually spend big bucks to get on the air with ads. But fortunately, I did a lot of interviews and I did a lot of grassroots stuff. And it built. I became, you know, this like go-to guy who, when people wanted, for some reason, I got into some of these reference books so that if somebody wanted a quote on the Beatles new album re-release of something they'd done years ago, or if there was a new book out, or if there was a controversy, anything like that, somehow I became the go-to, which led it a lot of credibility and a lot of ways to get inwards to press conferences and things that the Beatles themselves were doing. So that was pretty fortunate, because then when I was doing a convention in Detroit or Columbus or Seattle or Boston or all these places where I branched out to do conventions, it was already this established guy, Charles Rosenay, who does these things. And I never did the major markets. You know, the major markets were another person, another big event, and it's bigger than the world. But I had my little niche of doing these conventions and festivals in smaller areas. And it was just the greatest, because the music still lives for me. And you know, the Beatles are just the greatest band of all time.
I remember lying on the living room floor watching that Ed Sullivan Show, just like this. You know, there was so much hype for that appearance, and it was just fascinating just to be a part of it.
Yeah, and I didn't know the hype. I was listening to AM radio, and we had stations like WMCA, WABC, WINS. We had all these radio stations. I'm sure we're playing tons of Beatles along with the Four Seasons and whatever was being played at the time. But I just remember wanting to see Topo Gigio every Sunday. You know, hi Eddie, and he'd come out with the mouse, and then along with the mouse were these four guys, and the music. It was 3D. It jumped out of the screen. It was their personalities, their look, the sound, everything about
screaming.
It didn't just, it transformed the world. But me, you know, for me, it was like, wow, I want to do that. I want to be that. You know, I think every guy wanted to be a Beatle, and every girl wanted to either sleep or marry a Beatle, you know, sleep with a Beatle. And you couldn't do that. So what are the next best things? I don't know. You become a musician. You become a singer, you become a songwriter, you become a DJ, or in my case, I became a promoter, and all the things I did, you know, really revolved around the Beatles and my love of the Beatles.
Now, when you were growing up, did your parents buy you Teen Beat and all those other magazines?
16 magazine was the big one. Yeah, anything that if it had a cover with the Beatles, I would get it. I would get it, and I would add it to the collection. But even more so, if there was an article in a paper and it mentioned the Liverpool docks, or ships coming into Liverpool or anything Liverpool. Now, this was a magical, mystical city beyond, beyond the world, where the world was, ended. Liverpool began because my Beatles were from there. I'm giving you a transition here. And the Beatles were from Liverpool. And I was so fascinated with everything that had to do with Liverpool, but never in a million years thought I would ever go there. And
All right.
you're a kid,
So,
if you go to New York and you see a Broadway show, wow, that's a day, that's amazing. But it was always my dream to go to Liverpool.
so you went to Liverpool.
Yeah. So in
And
1983,
where did you meet David Bedford?
well, so in 1983, I brought a group with me. We all went to Liverpool as a group. And Liverpool Tours was a company I formed because I've been doing the conventions. I started putting out what was then a fanzine, but is a professional magazine called Good Day Sunshine. And it was read by thousands of people. And so I had this network of people who'd come to my conventions, knew of my events. If there was a Beatles film, I would show it, they would come. So this network was growing and growing and growing through the magazine and through the conventions and the festivals in all these cities. And so we did the Liverpool tour. And I didn't meet David Bedford, who's coming on in a few minutes yet. But he was bubbling under. He was in this area. And when I first went to Liverpool, my gosh, it didn't welcome fans like it does now. It was this place that was gray and dungy. And when we went to the street where the Beatles started the Cavern Club, everything was boarded up and scaffolded. And I'm like, I put my ear to the bricks and said, wow, I can only imagine the sounds. That it was almost like your background, the bricks, except grayer, dustier, and dirtier. And I put my ears to it, just trying to imagine. And even that was great and magical. And we met people like Alan Williams, who was the Beatles' first manager, and Bob Wooler, who was the Cavern DJ, and all these great people who were still alive then, who gave us some insight as to what it was like. But before we knew it, it exploded. Cavern City Tours, westernized and created a market for Beatle fans to come there and see tours. And eventually, we got a tour guide by the name of David Bedford, who took us to Liverpool and showed us the most amazing sites that we wouldn't have known where they were and heard the history of them all. And David and I actually met at one of the Beatles conventions that I produced in 2009, Beatles Expo in Connecticut. And from then on, we've been buddies, and he's the man. I mean, he's written more amazing things about Liverpool than I could ever imagine. And I think he would love to tell us about it.
All right, let's bring David in. Come in, David. Hi there, David.
That was
all the way
so
from
smooth.
England. Oh, he's good, isn't he?
He's good. I can't afford his PR, flipping heck.
Well, the great thing, Amber, is when David and I when he hosts the tours that I bring the fans over, it's a little bit Beatles and a little bit Abbott and Costello. There's a lot of comedy that goes on between us, and it really adds. People say, with my Dracula tours, with my Beatle tours, with everything I do, what makes it different? And I'd like to think it's personality. David doesn't have any, so I have to overcompensate, and I have to really.
And thank you very much, and good night.
The fun and everything.
David, you grew up in Liverpool. When did you first become aware of the Beatles?
So I was actually born in the year after Ed Sullivan. So I was born in 65. So I missed all of the actual Beatles stuff happening. I first became aware because the primary school, the elementary school, as you would call it, that I attended was St. Silas, which is Ringo Starr's primary school. So I was there at the age of 4 in 1969. So growing up in that Dingle area where Ringo's from, you're automatically aware that one of the Beatles came from there. But it's strange, just as Charles was describing Liverpool, and I was saying to somebody the other day, the 1970s in Liverpool had nothing to do with the Beatles. Because the strange thing was, as the Beatles were taking off and putting us on the map, Liverpool as a port was declining. And by the time you got to the early 70s, there was so much unemployment that over 200,000 people left to find work. So it was an unhappy place. The buildings were dark and smoky and grimy. No such thing as Beatles tourism. Nobody could imagine anything like that. So I was aware of them, and it was the music really that started for me when I first picked a guitar up. And the first songbook I got, The Beatles Complete, which 40 whatever years later I still have. And it's amazing because it's got the wrong lyrics, the wrong chords. It's terrible book, but it's brilliant. So I started learning the Beatles songs on guitar. So it's the music that got me first. And then it's weird, but then when my wife and we moved from the Dingle, came out to where we live now, which is just off Penny Lane. Now that was not deliberate. That was just where we found the house. And we got 3 daughters, all born in the same hospital as John Lennon, Oxford Street Memorial. And all 3 of them went to Dovedale School, which is the primary school that George Harrison and John Lennon attended as well. So basically, my whole life has been lived around the Beatles. So that's how I got into it.
We've got lots more of the interviews coming up.